51 women had glided past him, and Seo Dae-Hyun hadn't felt a single pulse of interest. He stood in the center of the Metropolitan Museum's gala, a champagne flute held loosely in his hand, watching the world's most famous models move like clockwork dolls. Their sapphire gowns and emerald silks cost more than a Harlem city block, but their smiles were practiced, sharp as glass, and designed specifically to harvest his wealth. Beneath the $10 million chandeliers, Dae-Hyun felt absolutely nothing. At 28, Dae-Hyun was the silent blade of the Seo syndicate, a man whose tailored black suit hid ink-stained skin and scars earned in the back alleys of Seoul. He was 6 feet 2 inches of controlled violence, with eyes that had seen too much treachery to ever find beauty in a facade. His business partner, Minho, kept count of the models, nudging him, whispering names of billionaires' daughters, but Dae-Hyun was already planning his exit. To him, this room was just a performance where everyone had a script but him. He knew that pretty faces usually hid the ugliest intentions. His own father had tried to trade him like a commodity in a marriage alliance before Dae-Hyun took the empire by force at 25. The music slowed, a heavy cello note vibrating through the marble floor, and that's when the crowd parted. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't wearing a gown. Nyah was simply a waitress in a crisp white shirt and black vest, carrying a silver tray with a grace that wasn't rehearsed. Her skin glowed like deep mahogany under the golden light, her hair pulled back in a confident, low bun. She was navigating a sea of egos with professional neutrality, until she stopped to serve a guest near the orchestra. Someone said something funny, and Nyah laughed. That smile hit Dae-Hyun like a physical blow. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't a play for his attention. It was 3 seconds of genuine warmth that cracked open a heart Dae-Hyun had spent a decade sealing in ice. He stopped mid-breath. His champagne glass stayed frozen at his lips as the world turned into a blur around her. Did you just ignore a Forbes-listed heiress to stare at the staff? Minho hissed. Dae-Hyun didn't answer. His feet were already moving, cutting through the elite crowd with a predatory stride. But by the time he reached the service door, she was gone. He stood there, the most powerful man in the room, staring at a swinging door like a man who had just lost his breath. Find out who she is, Dae-Hyun commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Name, address, everything. I want her file on my desk before the sun comes up. The dossier arrived on his desk at 4:30 a.m., a sleek leather folder that seemed too heavy for the few pages it contained. Minho stood by the window of the penthouse, his silhouette sharp against the awakening Manhattan skyline. Her name is Nyah Rivers, Minho said, his voice devoid of its usual playfulness. 23, senior at Columbia on a full scholarship. Biology major. She works 30 hours a week between that gala catering firm and a small, family-owned cafe in Harlem called The Daily Grind. No criminal record. No powerful connections. She's nobody, Dae-Hyun. Dae-Hyun didn't look up from the photograph clipped to the first page. It wasn't a professional headshot like the ones the 51 models had submitted to his office. It was a candid shot from a social media profile, Nyah laughing over a textbook, a smudge of ink on her cheek, her eyes crinkling in that same devastating way he'd seen at the Waldorf. She isn't nobody, Dae-Hyun murmured, the words feeling like a vow. She's the first real thing I've seen in years. By 8 a.m., the black Mercedes Maybach pulled up to a modest curb on a street lined with brownstones and the vibrant energy of Harlem. The neighborhood was a symphony of slamming car doors, distant sirens, and the smell of fresh street food, a world away from the sterile, hushed hallways of the Seo syndicate. Dae-Hyun stepped out, and the sidewalk seemed to ripple. He was a visual dissonance in this environment. His custom-tailored black suit and the cold, predatory grace of his stride made him look like a god who had accidentally descended into a mortal marketplace. He pushed open the door of the Daily Grind. A bell chimed, thin and bright. The cafe was small, smelling of roasted beans and cinnamon, with mismatched wooden chairs and local art taped to the walls. And there she was. Nyah was behind the counter, her hair tied up in a messy bun, a green apron over a simple t-shirt. She was mid-sentence, laughing with an elderly man at the register, her hands moving with the same effortless rhythm he'd memorized the night before. Then she looked up. The heir left the room. Nyah's smile didn't falter so much as it transformed into a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. She recognized him. How could she not? People didn't just forget the man who had looked at them like they were the only living soul in a room full of ghosts. Dae-Hyun didn't wait for an invitation. He walked toward the counter, his presence shrinking the cozy space until it felt like it was just the two of them. The other patrons went quiet, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. He stopped at the register, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a gravity that made the floor feel unstable. "A black coffee," Dae-Hyun said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated through the small shop. Nyah blinked, her fingers tightening around a porcelain mug. She took in the luxury watch, the subtle tattoo peeking from his collar, and the sheer, overwhelming wealth he radiated. We don't serve champagne here," she said, her voice steady despite the shock written across her face. "And I'm pretty sure you're lost, Mr. Waldorf." Dae-Hyun leaned in just an inch, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm exactly where I intended to be, Nyah Rivers." The silence in the cafe wasn't the respectful quiet Dae-Hyun was used to. It was the heavy, expectant hush of a neighborhood watching a predator enter a sanctuary. He remained leaning against the counter, his presence an expensive stain on the modest woodwork, expecting the usual reaction, stammering, blushing, or the frantic desire to please. Instead, Nyah Rivers reached for a Sharpie and a paper cup. She didn't look at his watch. She didn't look at the tailored lines of his suit. She looked directly into his eyes, her gaze as steady as a surgeon's. "That'll be $4.50, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "And since you clearly skipped the line, you can wait by the end of the counter like everyone else, Mr. Seo." Dae-Hyun's brow flickered. It was the first time in 5 years anyone had told him where to stand. He pulled a $100 bill from a slim platinum clip and slid it across the wood. "Keep the change." Nyah didn't touch the money. She slid it back toward him with the tip of her finger, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to something sharper, more clinical. "We don't do keep the change for ego trips. $4.50. Exact change or a card. And I'd prefer if you took your security detail outside. They're blocking the light and scaring my regulars." Dae-Hyun felt a strange, electric jolt in his chest, not of anger, but of genuine, startled interest. He signaled with a microscopic nod toward the window, and the two shadows in the Maybach outside vanished. He produced a $5 bill, watched her hand him back 2 quarters, and then followed her instruction, moving to the pickup station. When she brought him the coffee, she didn't just hand it over. She set it down and leaned her elbows on the counter, closing the distance between them until he could smell the faint scent of vanilla and roasted cocoa clinging to her. "Let's be real for a second," she said, her voice dropped to a private, dangerous whisper. "You didn't come here for a caffeine fix. You used your resources to track down a student who was just doing her job at a gala. In my world, we don't call that romantic. We call that stalking." The word hung between them, heavy and ugly. Dae-Hyun's jaw tightened. "I wanted to ensure you were compensated for your service." Nyah let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any of the warmth from the night before. "I got my paycheck from the Waldorf. What you're doing right now, this is about control. You're used to people being frozen by you, but I'm on the clock and I have a midterm in 3 hours. I don't have time to be a character in whatever dark, lonely fantasy you're playing out." Dae-Hyun looked at her, really looked at her, and realized for the first time that his power was a localized currency. It meant nothing to a woman who belonged entirely to herself. He felt the sudden, desperate need to be seen as something other than a boss. "I apologize," he said, and for once, the words weren't a performance. "You're right. It was tactical, and it was wrong." Nyah studied him, her eyes softening just a fraction at the unexpected honesty in his tone. "Better," she whispered. "Now, drink your coffee and leave. If you want to talk to me like a human being, try coming back when you aren't trying to buy the room." Dae-Hyun returned 3 days later, but not in the Maybach. He arrived on foot, wearing a simple charcoal sweater that hugged his frame, his dark hair windswept and less guarded. He waited until Nyah's shift ended, leaning against a brick wall across the street, looking less like a predator and more like a man waiting for a chance at redemption. When Nyah stepped out, she didn't look surprised. She simply adjusted her backpack and pointed towards St. Nicholas Park. They walked in silence for a while, the afternoon sun filtering through the changing leaves, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. "I didn't think you'd actually come back without the army," Nyah said, her voice lighter than it had been in the cafe. "I figured the boss didn't do public parks." "The boss doesn't," Dae-Hyun admitted, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "But the man who couldn't stop thinking about your smile does. I've spent my life in rooms where the air is filtered and every word is a move on a chessboard. This feels dangerously unscripted." They reached a quiet bench near a stone wall. As Dae-Hyun sat, he tilted his head, and the late afternoon light caught the jagged line of the scar creeping up from beneath his collar. Up close, it was brutal, a reminder of a world where consequences were measured in blood. It was the kind of mark that usually made women look away or ask about the danger to thrill themselves. Dae-Hyun felt the familiar urge to pull up his collar, to hide the monster beneath the expensive wool. He waited for the flinch, the judgment, or the inevitable question about who he had killed to get it. But Nyah didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in closer, her brown eyes scanning the silvered line with a heartbreakingly soft focus. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch from his skin, granting him the dignity of personal space while offering a closeness he hadn't felt in a decade. "Does it still hurt?" she asked quietly. Dae-Hyun froze. The air in his lungs seemed to crystallize. "What?" "The scar," Nyah clarified, her gaze lifting to meet his. "It looks like it was a deep one. I'm a biology major. I see the way the tissue knitted back together. It looks like it took a long time to heal." "I'm not asking who gave it to you, Dae-Hyun. I'm asking if you're still in pain." The breath he'd been holding hitched in his throat. For years, people had seen that scar as a warning label or a badge of terror. No one had ever considered the nerves beneath it. No one had ever asked about the lingering ache of the wound itself. In that moment, the Mafia boss persona he had cultivated like armor felt paper-thin and useless. Nyah wasn't looking at the heir to a syndicate. She was looking at a man who had survived something terrible. "Only when it rains," he whispered, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that would have terrified his underlings. Nyah gave him a small, sad smile, the same genuine warmth that had stopped his heart at the gala. "Then we'll have to make sure you stay out of the rain," she said. Dae-Hyun realized then that he was in far more danger than he had ever been in a back-alley fight. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be the boss. He just wanted to be the man who deserved the way she was looking at him right now. The golden warmth of the park felt like a fever dream the moment Dae-Hyun stepped back into the sterile, marble-clad sanctuary of his corporate headquarters. The transition was jarring, from the scent of autumn leaves and Nyah's soft empathy to the smell of ozone, expensive cigars, and the suffocating weight of expectation. Waiting for him in the high-backed leather chair of his private office was a ghost of his father's past, his uncle Seo-Dae. Seo-Dae didn't rise. He sat with his hands folded over a silver-topped cane, his eyes like two pieces of flint. On the mahogany desk between them lay a series of grainy, high-resolution photographs. Dae-Hyun didn't need to look at them to know what they depicted. Him sitting on a park bench, his guard down, his collar open, and a black waitress reaching out to touch the one thing he had spent a lifetime hiding. "You are becoming careless, Dae-Hyun," Seo-Dae said, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering over pavement. "The board is talking. The families in Seoul are asking why the heir to the Seo syndicate is spending his afternoons in Harlem instead of overseeing the docks." Dae-Hyun walked to the window, his back to the old man, his reflection in the glass looking more like a stranger every day. "The docks are fine, uncle. My personal time is my own." "Nothing is your own," Seo-Dae snapped, the cane thudding against the floor. "You are the blood of this empire. And that girl, she is a distraction we cannot afford. I've seen her file. A student? A server of drinks? She is a temporary curiosity, a whim of the flesh. But you are treating her like an anchor. Remember this. Waitresses are replaceable. They are like the champagne flutes she carries, fragile, transparent, and easily discarded when they break. The empire, however, is eternal. It is built on the bones of those who thought they could have both power and a heart. The comparison made Dae-Hyun's jaw ache with suppressed rage. He thought of Nyah's hands, not fragile, but strong, capable, and honest. He thought of her question about his pain, a question no one in this room of gold and blood would ever think to ask. "I am not my father," Dae-Hyun said, turning slowly. His voice was no longer the low rumble he used with Nyah. It was the cold, lethal edge of the Mafia boss. "And I am done building a world on bones." Sang-ok narrowed his eyes. "Be careful, nephew. Your father's shadow is long, and it does not take kindly to those who try to step out of it." As soon as the door closed behind the old man, Dae-Hyun picked up the internal phone. He didn't call security. He called his legal team and his lead financial strategist. The encounter had confirmed his greatest fear. The syndicate was no longer just a burden. It was a target on Nyah's back. "Start the liquidation of the South Street holdings," Dae-Hyun commanded, his eyes fixed on the photograph of Nyah's smile. "I want the transition to the real estate investment trust finalized by the end of the quarter. Move the illegal contracts to the black file for total termination. We're going legitimate. And we're doing it now." He was moving the pieces of a global chessboard, but for the first time, he wasn't playing for territory or profit. He was playing for time. He had to burn the empire down before it could consume the only person who had ever seen him as a man. The transition from the boardroom to the roof of the CO Tower felt like crossing into another dimension. Dae-Hyun stood by the edge of the helipad, the wind whipping his hair and tugging at the charcoal sweater that had become his favorite disguise. Below them, Manhattan was a sprawling carpet of electric jewels, but he only had eyes for the woman stepping out of the elevator. Nyah was dressed for a night in the city, a simple black dress and a denim jacket. And as she took in the view, her breath hitched, a soft sound that mattered more to him than any billion-dollar closing. "I've lived in this city my whole life," Nyah whispered, walking toward the glass railing. "But I've never seen it like this. It's terrifyingly beautiful. Most people see the power when they look at this view," Dae-Hyun said, stepping up behind her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her shoulders. "They see the buildings they want to own, the people they want to rule. But when I look at it tonight, all I see is how small everything else is compared to this moment." Nyah turned to him, her face bathed in the soft, silver glow of the moon. "You're doing it again, Mr. Waldorf. You're talking like a man who carries the weight of every skyscraper on his back. Why can't you just be here? Just you?" Dae-Hyun looked down at his hands, the hands that had signed death warrants and moved mountains of shadow money. He realized that the greatest secret he held wasn't a bank account or a criminal operation. It was the identity he had buried under the title of boss. "My father called me Dae-Hyun because it means great virtue," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "He wanted me to be a monument. But before the syndicate, before the ink on my skin and the scars, my mother used to call me something else. Something private. Something that didn't belong to the CO name." He took a step closer, the distance between them dissolving. "To the world, I am Seo Dae-Hyun. But if you're going to stay in this moment with me, I want you to know me as Min-Suk. Just Min-Suk." The air between them changed. The title, the Mafia, and the models vanished into the night air. Nyah reached up, her palm coming to rest against his cheek, her skin a warm, grounding contrast to the cold wind. "Min-Suk," she repeated, the name sounding like music in her voice. "It's a good name. It sounds like someone who deserves to be happy." She didn't wait for him to move. She leaned in, and when their lips met, it wasn't the practiced, hollow kiss of a gala guest or a transaction. It was the collision of worlds the stars had promised. It was Harlem meeting the Heights. It was the smell of lavender and old books crashing into the scent of expensive rain and cedarwood. In that kiss, Dae-Hyun felt the ice in his chest shatter completely. For the first time in 28 years, he wasn't a boss, an heir, or a predator. He was a man who had finally found home in the one place he was never supposed to look. He pulled her closer, his heart thudding against hers, realizing that while he might have walked past 51 models to find her, he would walk through fire to keep her. The golden glow of the rooftop date felt like a distant, cruel memory the moment Nyah stepped into her third-floor walk-up. The first thing she noticed wasn't what was there, but what was missing. The silence was wrong. Usually, the faint hum of her roommate's white noise machine or the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock greeted her. Tonight, there was only the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. She flicked the light switch, and her heart dropped into her stomach. The living room was a battlefield of her own life. Her biology textbooks had been ripped from the shelves, their spines cracked like ribs. The small potted succulent she'd tended for 3 years lay shattered on the hardwood, soil scattered like ash. It wasn't a robbery. Her laptop sat untouched on the coffee table. This was a message. Dae-Hyun, she whispered, her voice trembling. She knew he wasn't there, but his world had clearly arrived in his stead. She moved toward her bedroom, her footsteps crunching on broken glass. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches. The door was slightly ajar. When she pushed it open, she saw that the rest of the apartment had been a distraction for the true centerpiece. Her bed had been stripped of its linens, the white mattress looking like a sterile operating table. Resting dead center on the pillow was a single, heavy card. It was matte black, textured like expensive snakeskin, with no name or address. Only the embossed gold crest of the Seo Syndicate. Nyah didn't pick it up. She didn't have to. The card radiated a cold, predatory energy that made the room feel 20 degrees colder. This was the warning shot Dae-Hyun's world had promised. It was a reminder that while she had been kissing a man named Min-suk on a rooftop, the Mafia boss was the one who actually owned the sky. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The genuine warmth she had offered him, the way she hadn't flinched at his scar, it had all been a beautiful, dangerous naivety. She looked at her trembling hands and realized they were no longer just the hands of a student or a waitress. They were the hands of a liability. She thought of her mother in California, whose rent was paid by the very checks Nyah earned at the Waldorf. She thought of her roommates, innocent girls who were now sleeping in a target zone. The collision of worlds Dae-Hyun had whispered about wasn't a romantic metaphor. It was a disaster. She backed away from the bed, her eyes fixed on that black card as if it were a venomous snake. The silence of the apartment was suddenly deafening, filled with the unspoken threats of men who didn't care about realness or authenticity. For the first time since she had smiled at the man with the champagne flute, Nyah Rivers was truly, deeply afraid. She grabbed her phone, her thumb hovering over Dae-Hyun's name, but she stopped. If she called him, she was playing their game. If she stayed, she was a target. The dream of the rooftop was over. The nightmare of the syndicate had officially begun. The black Maybach was idling outside Nyah's apartment when she finally emerged, her eyes red-rimmed, and her belongings shoved hastily into a single duffel bag. She expected Dae-Hyun to jump out, to wrap her in those strong arms, and tell her his security team would make it all go away. She expected the man who had whispered his real name to her on a moonlit rooftop. Instead, the rear window rolled down just halfway, revealing only the cold, impenetrable mask of the Mafia boss. Dae-Hyun didn't get out. He didn't even look at her. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set like granite, the light from the street lamps catching the sharp, dangerous edge of his profile. Dae-Hyun, she breathed, reaching for the door handle. They were in my room. They left a card. I don't know what to do. Don't call me that, he snapped, his voice a jagged blade that sliced through the Harlem air. He finally turned his head, but the warmth she had come to know was gone, replaced by a gaze so hollow it made her blood run cold. And don't touch the car. You're getting grease on the finish. Nyah froze, her hand hovering in the air. What are you talking about? Dae-Hyun, I'm scared. Your uncle. My uncle was right. He interrupted, his tone bored, clinical. He flicked a speck of imaginary dust from his sleeve. I played a game, Nyah. I wanted to see if realness felt as good as they say in the movies. It was a curiosity, a palate cleanser after 51 models who were starting to look the same. But the game is over, and frankly, it's becoming expensive. The duffel bag slipped from Nyah's fingers, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. A game? The rooftop? The park? You told me your mother's name for me. Dae-Hyun let out a short, mocking huff. I told you what you needed to hear to keep that genuine smile on your face. That's the problem with people like you. You think a few hours of conversation means you've seen a man's soul. You haven't seen anything but what I allowed you to see. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it out the window. It landed at her feet. That's enough to get you to California and keep you there. Change your number. Finish your degree. Consider it a very generous tip for the best performance of the season. Nyah felt as though the ground had opened up beneath her. The betrayal was so sudden, so total, that she couldn't even find the breath to scream. She looked at the man in the car, the tailored suit, the luxury watch, the cold eyes, and realized the Min Suk she had loved was a ghost he had conjured just to haunt her. You're a monster, she whispered, tears finally spilling over. I'm a Seo, he corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. And monsters don't have room for waitresses. Drive. As the car sped away, leaving her standing alone in the dark, Dae-Hyun finally collapsed against the leather seat, his lungs burning as he fought for air. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he saw her crying, he knew he would stop the car, and if he stopped the car, the snipers his uncle had placed on the surrounding rooftops would finish what the black card had started. He had broken her heart to save her life, and as he watched her disappear in the rearview mirror, he knew he had just sentenced himself to a lifetime in the cold. The weeks that followed the abandonment of Nyah Rivers were the bloodiest in the history of the Seo syndicate. Dae-Hyun moved through the city like a winter storm, cold, relentless, and utterly indifferent to the destruction he left in his wake. He no longer slept. He stayed in his glass-walled office until the sun bled over the horizon, his desk covered in the black files he was using to dismantle his own family. The Mafia boss the world feared had been a mask, but the man he became now was something far more terrifying. He was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a human being fueled by a singular, burning purpose. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see the ledgers of his empire. He saw Nyah standing on that Harlem sidewalk, clutching an envelope of tip money while her heart broke in her eyes. That memory was the only thing that kept him moving as he systematically purged the rot from the organization. He started with the shipping docks, terminating contracts with the human traffickers and the drug runners who had paid his father for protection for decades. When the lieutenants protested, Dae-Hyun met them in the rain-slicked alleys of the Bronx, his Tom Ford suit ruined by grime, his knuckles split and bleeding. He didn't use guards. He used the rage of a man who had lost the only thing that made him feel alive. One by one, the old guard fell, replaced by legitimate security firms or simply removed from the board entirely. You're burning the house down to kill a few spiders, Dae-Hyun, Minho warned him one night, watching as Dae-Hyun signed over a massive block of illegal real estate to a public housing trust. There won't be anything left of the Seo name by the time you're done. The Seo name deserves to die, Dae-Hyun replied, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't look up from the papers. He looked older, the scar on his neck appearing more prominent against his pale, exhausted skin. I'm not building an empire anymore. I'm building a fortress where the shadow of my father can never reach again. The final target was the inner circle, the men who had helped his uncle place those snipers on the Harlem rooftops. Dae-Hyun didn't kill them. He did something worse. He stripped them of their assets, leaked their offshore accounts to the federal authorities, and left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the knowledge that they had crossed the wrong man. He became a legend in the underworld, the boss who turned on his own kind. But in the quiet moments, when the sirens faded and the office was still, he would pull a crumpled, ink-stained napkin from his pocket. It was the one he'd taken from the daily grind on that first day. He would trace the logo with a trembling finger, remembering the smell of cinnamon and the sound of a genuine laugh. He was a ghost ruling a crumbling kingdom, a man of shadows who had purged the world of his enemies, only to realize that the silence he had created was the loudest pain of all. He had won the war, but as he stared out at the city he now truly owned, he had never felt more like a prisoner. The heavy, smoke-filled air of the underworld had been replaced by the scent of fresh rain and expensive ink. A year had passed since the night Seo Dae-Hyun had burned his world to the ground to save the only thing that mattered, and the city reflected his transformation. The towering glass monolith that once housed the Sun crime family was now the headquarters of Dae-Hyun Holdings, a name that commanded respect in the light of day rather than fear in the dark of night. Dae-Hyun stood on the observation deck, his reflection in the glass no longer looking like a stranger. He wore a gray linen suit, the collar open to catch the breeze, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to hide the scar on his neck. It was no longer a badge of shame or a sign of his father's violence. It was a mark of survival. The syndicate was a ghost of the past, dismantled piece by piece. The shipping docks were now hubs for international trade, and the real estate portfolio had been converted into affordable housing and community development projects. He was no longer a mafia boss. He was a businessman with a soul, a man who measured his success not by the bodies he stepped over, but by the lives he helped build. He had funded scholarships for biology students, built community centers in Harlem, and ensured that the old guard would never have the power to threaten a single soul again. His uncle was gone, his influence erased by the sheer force of Dae-Hyun's newfound legitimacy. Min-ho entered the office, not with a file of surveillance photos, but with a quarterly report on a youth taekwondo program. "The transition is complete, Dae-Hyun," he said, and for once, his voice held a warmth that matched his partner's. "We're officially clean. The board is thrilled, and the city actually likes us." "Who would have thought?" Dae-Hyun nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the distance. "I didn't do it for the city, Min-ho." "I know," Min-ho replied softly. "And you don't have to be a ghost anymore. The fortress is finished. It's safe now." Dae-Hyun touched the glass, his fingers resting where the Harlem skyline met the clouds. He had spent 12 months building a world where he could finally look at himself in the mirror. He had transformed an empire of blood into a legacy of light, but the victory felt hollow in the silence of his office. He had the wealth, he had the power, and he finally had the freedom he had craved since he was 16. But as he looked out at the sprawling metropolis, he realized that a businessman with a soul still needed the one heart that had seen his soul when it was still covered in shadows. He was a man of light now, and it was finally time to find the woman who had held the torch for him in the dark. The small flower shop in a quiet corner of Charleston smelled of jasmine and damp earth, a scent so far removed from the sterile glass towers of Manhattan that it felt like another world entirely. Nyah Rivers stood at the back, trimming the stems of deep red roses, her hands moving with the confident, practiced grace of someone who had finally found her own peace. She had spent a year in this coastal sanctuary, healing from a heartbreak she once thought would be her end. She had finished her degree, she had kept her mother safe, and she had built a life out of petals and sunlight. She didn't look up when the bell above the door chimed. "I'll be with you in just a moment," she said, her voice steady and warm. "The peonies just came in, and they're breathtaking." The customer didn't answer. There was no sound of footsteps, only a heavy, expectant silence that made the small of her back tingle with a sudden, impossible familiarity. The air in the shop seemed to shift, growing thick with the scent of cedarwood and expensive rain. Nyah's breath hitched. She knew that silence. She had lived in it for months after a black Maybach had sped away into a Harlem night. She turned slowly, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Standing near a bucket of sunflowers was a man who looked like a dream she had forced herself to forget. He wasn't the mafia boss. He wasn't the predator in the Tom Ford suit. He was dressed in a simple white linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos that were no longer a threat, but a history. His face was leaner, his eyes softer, and the scar on his neck was fully visible, a silver thread of truth against his skin. "The peonies are beautiful," Min-suk said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that finally broke the year-long winter in her chest. "But I didn't come for the flowers." Nyah gripped the shears so hard her knuckles turned white. "You found me. I never stopped looking," he whispered, taking a single step forward. The distance between them was only a few feet of wooden floor and scattered petals, but it felt like a lifetime of obstacles. "The fortress is finished, Nyah." The monsters are gone. I've spent every second of the last 12 months becoming the man who deserved to stand in this room with you. Nyah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw that the frozen man from the gala was gone. The mask had been discarded, leaving only the soul she had touched in a Harlem park. She remembered the envelope he had thrown, the cold words he had used to drive her away, and she saw the agony in his eyes that told her he had felt every bit of that pain too. "You broke my heart, Min Suk," she said, a single tear escaping to track through the faint dust of pollen on her cheek. "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I broke my own to save yours. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving unless you tell me there's no room for me in your world." He didn't wait for her to answer. This time, he didn't freeze. As Nyah let the shears fall and took a trembling step toward him, he did something he had never done in a ballroom full of models. He smiled back. It was a genuine, uncalculated expression of joy that transformed his face from devastatingly handsome to beautifully human. When they collided this time, it wasn't a spark, it was a homecoming. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck, and as the scent of jasmine swirled around them, the worlds of the boss and the waitress finally dissolved into one. They were just two people, real and messy and whole, who had walked through the dark to find a smile that would never fade again.